The next three books on how to understand the Red Army on the Eastern Front in World War II are Stumbling Colossus, Colossus Reborn, and When Titans Clashed. The first two books are the most detailed organizational histories of the Red Army that cover 1941 to 1943. When Titans Clashed is a broad overview of the entire war on the Eastern Front. Stumbling Colossus, The Red Army on the Eve of World War II by David M. Glantz is essentially about what the Red Army was like before Operation Barbarossa, in all of its details and deficiencies. This is the best book that demystifies the Red Army's half-developed condition prior to World War II, and you will understand why the Soviets, despite their superior size, lost over 4.4 million casualties in 1941 and suffered some of the worst defeats in military history. Stumbling Colossus starts by covering Red Army military intelligence at the beginning of World War II. Then it moves on to strategic deployment and mobilization of its gigantic pool of 12 million reservists, most of which were only partially trained. The nature of the Soviet soldier is examined, which was composed of semi-literate workers and peasants from different parts of the country with different ethnic backgrounds. Other issues are analyzed: size and structure of the force, command and control, combat readiness of ground combat forces, including rifle, mechanized, cavalry, and airborne, combat readiness of combat support and rear service forces, including artillery, engineers, signals, and air defense, the VVS, or Soviet Air Force, the condition of the Statka and strategic reserves. The Soviet Union, just before Operation Barbarossa in 1941, had the largest army in the world, with the most tanks, artillery, and aircraft. But all of this was a mask, an illusion of real military strength and real combat power. While the Soviets had collected the most tanks, artillery pieces, and aircraft in the world, the actual level of training and organizational development of the Red Army was very deficient compared to their future enemy, Germany. For instance, the mechanized corps of the Red Army was aimed at matching the power of the German panzer groups, but their actual condition was actually shambolic, totally combat ineffective, and logistically unsustainable. The mechanized corps broke down in combat in the first battles of 1941. Russian tank crews got little training, while German crews of their premier divisions had 2 years of pre-war training and years of combat experience. Developmental problems existed in the state of their artillery and rifle divisions. Worse, Russian pilots were trained with several times less flight hours than the Germans and were relatively combat inexperienced. All of this was not unexpected, as the Soviets estimated that the Red Army would not be combat ready before the summer of 1942. But the Germans didn't wait. They invaded an entire year early. However, it was not all terrible. Intellectually, the Red Army was forward-thinking. The progressive development of the Red Army owed much to the professional Russian officers of non-communist origins. They were of the Whites and Tsarist Russia that switched sides after the communist victory in the Russian Civil War. They were the educated men that dominated Russia's top-level leadership and general staff positions. Men like Marshal Tuvkalevsky and his disciples who developed the combat doctrine of deep operations or the Soviet Blitzkrieg. Men like Alexander Sevchin, who developed attritional and positional warfare concepts. The pre-war Red Army developed deep battle, armored warfare, aviation, and airborne troops, and put them intellectually on the cutting edge. But the problems facing the Red Army was not intellectual, but more of practical execution of their lofty ideals and combat doctrine. The decline of the Red Army started with a purge of some 47,000 officers starting from 1937, and this continued even into World War II. This is due to Stalin's paranoia and his desire to eliminate the remaining Tsarist military officers that once fought for the other side in the Russian Civil War. The Soviets were afraid that these former enemy soldiers would betray the state someday in a military coup. So Stalin basically decapitated his own army and destroyed years of progress within the Red Army. Any rank colonel and above was purged of some of their most effective and best trained leaders. It also created an atmosphere of fear and paralyzed the remaining officers in the Red Army and greatly degraded the quality of the Red Army. As a consequence, the purged Red Army performed poorly in Poland and in Finland in 1939. At the same time, the German Wehrmacht demonstrated the Blitzkrieg campaigns in the West and established themselves as the greatest army in the world and trashed the British and the French. While Blitzkrieg was happening, the Soviets desperately expanded their underdeveloped army from 1.5 million men to 5.4 million men to meet the emerging threat of an Axis invasion. This was akin to further self-sabotage after the Purges. They created a huge, lower-quality army filled with deficiently trained reservists led by a thinned-out officer corps. The newly expanded Red Army and Air Force suffered severe deficiencies at all levels and all departments. Not only was equipment missing, but leadership, a good training system, and good organization. There was not enough ammunition, not enough food, and not enough transport, vehicles and horses, to support a 5.4 million man army. Germany was also innovative, but unlike the Soviet Union, it executed with great success its military innovations. The Red Army was in essence a half-developed and half-trained military that rested on a core of innovative ideas. They simply had not reached the level of development of their enemies. But despite of all of these Soviet failings, the Germans were also in trouble. Things were not going as planned as early as the summer of 1941 during the Battle for Smolensk. Operation Barbarossa was getting derailed. There was increasing realization that there would be no fast dash into Moscow for an ultimate victory. On August 11, 1941, Chief of the German Army High Command, or OKH, General Franz Halder, notes painfully in his war diary, "The High Command is stuck and we can't change our situation. The army groups are separated by natural obstacles. Our final reserves have been committed. The whole situation makes it obvious that we have underestimated the Russian Colossus, which was prepared for war with that utterly ruthless determination so characteristic of totalitarian states. This applies to organizational and economic resources, as well as the communication system, and most of all, their military personnel. In the beginning of the war, we thought that they had 200 divisions. So far, we have already counted 360. So ultimately, the German gambit was futile. Despite so many operational and tactical victories, the Axis forces could not anticipate and prevent the rebuilding of the Red Army, which replaced all of their massive losses. The war continued, and Soviet reserves won the battle for Moscow. The next book is Colossus Reborn, The Red Army at War. This is a sequel to Stumbling Colossus, which focuses on the Red Army's painful but ultimately successful reform process after most of the army was destroyed in 1941. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, the Red Army rebuilt itself over and over again, regardless of millions upon millions of additional human losses throughout 1942 and 1943. Every time it rebuilt itself, it became stronger and stronger, and more advanced in development. Colossus Reborn is a massive and very dense 750-page tome on the Red Army, and it is a masterpiece of research. This book provides an absolutely astonishing level of detail on the Red Army organization and operations in what the Russians refer to as the first and second periods of the war. Colossus Reborn covers strategy, doctrine, infantry, armor, artillery, engineer, combat support, air force, leadership, and training. It covers all major aspects of the Red Army bureaucracy and its departments, and focuses on how it was reformed and reorganized throughout the war, from a stumbling Colossus to a Colossus Reborn that was capable of driving the German army from Stalingrad to Berlin. The Red Army departments that are covered include rifle and airborne troops, NKVD, tank and mechanized forces, cavalry, artillery, air force, service and support, which include engineer, signal, chemical, railroad, auto transport, road, and construction. Other departments covered are the Red Army Strategic Leadership and Control, Central Military Administration, which includes the NKVD, General Staff, NKO, Officer Corps and Command, and the Red Army Soldier. Colossus Reborn further provides orders of battle and a comprehensive organizational layout. It's extremely detailed and statistics heavy. Readers can see how the massive improvement in force capabilities developed during the war. There's an evolution of combat doctrine and organizational change and force upgrades, from personnel to equipment, culminating with a steady increase in tactical and operational capabilities. The Red Army of 1943 was extremely evolved compared to 1941, and without it, the Soviets could not have won the war. Basically, the pre-war ideal of deep battle was effectively realized after millions of casualties due to a systematic and continuous effort at reform. So in 1943, the Soviets finally had the army that they wished they had in 1939. I would recommend reading Colossus Reborn at the end of your journey of studying the Red Army organization, as for beginners, it is overwhelming. You should certainly read Nemesis, the Red Army, and Keys to Victory by Walter Dunn first before you tackle this. But if you manage to really learn what's in here, you've passed the test and you can really understand campaign and operational histories of the Eastern Front to a much higher level. It's a great book and history of one of the largest and scariest bureaucracies of all time. After you finish Colossus Reborn, you can move on to an overall history of the war. A great place to start is When Titans Clashed by David M. Glantz and John House. Both Glantz and House are experts on the Soviet armed forces. David M. Glantz is pretty much a titan in Eastern Front military publishing that has devoted his life to the study of the Russian army. Both men have strong pedigrees in the US military as Soviet army experts. House was a professor of military history at the US Army General Staff College. Glantz was the editor of Slavic Military Studies. When Titans Clashed is a densely packed summary and statistical overview of the war on the Eastern Front. It functions as a gateway to more advanced material. It's a good source of statistics for casualties and the size of battles, and it retains its value as a reference for the entire war. The war is cataloged in the Russian style. The war on the Eastern Front is subdivided into 3 periods. The first period, June 1941 to November 1942. This includes Operation Barbarossa, Battle for Moscow, Leningrad, Stalingrad, among countless other engagements. The second period, November 1942 to December 1943. Highlights are the Soviet winter counteroffensives of 1942 and 1943, Battle for Kursk, Battle for the Dnieper. Third period, January 1944 to May 1945. The Red Army advances into the Ukraine, Romania, Hungary, Austria, Baltics, East Prussia, and many other countries. When Titans Clashed integrates politics, economics, and society, and presents how the Soviets overcame their initial disasters and fought from Moscow to Berlin. It covers not only the well-known battles, but the countless battles in between. Other topics include the Red Army before the war, Soviet strategy and tactics, Stalin's role, Soviet commanders, German points of view, the effect of D-Day and the Second Front on the Soviet war effort, the war's impact on the Soviet economy and the civilian population. Like all of Glantz's work, When Titans Clashed is stronger with Soviet primary and secondary sources than German, leading to a more Russian view of the war that can be balanced with German military history about the same campaigns and battles. So this concludes the 14 best books to really understand the Red Army in World War II. To remind you of what they are again: Penalty Strike, T-34 in Action, Panzer Killers, The Tanks of Operation Barbarossa, Red Army Tank Commanders, History of the Second Guards Tank Army, The Russian Way of War, Soviet Military Operational Art, Strategy, Architect of Soviet Victory in World War II, Nemesis, the Red Army, Keys to Victory, Stumbling Colossus, Colossus Reborn, and When Titans Clashed. After absorbing all of this information, I recommend using a second tier, a set of 4 additional books to further your tactical education. First, Tank Warfare on the Eastern Front, 1941 to 1942, Schwerpunkt by Robert Forsyth. Tank Warfare on the Eastern Front, 1943 to 1945, Red Steamroller, also by Robert Forsyth. These 2 must-read books are nuanced and are very helpful in understanding the dynamic change and interactions of the armored forces of Germany and Russia on the Eastern Front in World War II. They are both well-researched and accurate and complement the 2-volume history of the Second Guards Tank Army by Igor Nabolsin. Then, after you finish up with armored warfare, you should move on to studying the Soviet Combined Arms Infantry Army. These infantry armies are the most common formation of the Red Army on the Eastern Front. Thankfully, in the West, there are 2 good infantry army histories that deep dive into the armies. These are the 64th Army at Stalingrad, 1942 to 1943, a day-to-day account of a Soviet Combined Arms Infantry Army during the Battle for Stalingrad. The 7th Guards Army from Kursk to Prague, 1943 to 1945, a day-to-day account of a Soviet Guards Combined Arms Infantry Army. Students of the Battle for Stalingrad will recognize the 64th Army under the command of General Shumilov, alongside the more famous 62nd Army under Marshal Zhukov. As a recognition of the 64th Army's achievements, it was elevated to the status of the 7th Guards Army and employed in offensive operations in the second half of World War II. After reading these 4 additional books, you've read 18 of the best books about the Red Army on the Eastern Front in World War II. So from now on, you can read any advanced material on the battles and campaigns of the Eastern Front with a high level of understanding of the organizational and tactical dynamics of the Red Army and its combat units. You will also be literate in reading Russian military primary source documents, either translated or in Russian. Thanks so much for watching. Please help out this channel by liking, subscribing, and ringing the notification bell. And check out the playlist. Comment below on what interests you about the Red Army.